So I recently did a video which was centered around why I felt episode 3 of Adolescence was perfect, and whilst most shows don't usually produce 2 gems, this one did exactly that. Episode 4 of Adolescence was definitely one of the most interesting endings to a show that I've seen in a long while. Not only was the approach to this type of show different to what we've come to expect with traditional police and murder dramas, but the ending of it was one which provided no resolution. Usually we'd get the fleshing out of the investigation, the trial, the sentencing, and then as the doors of the cell closed, a brief moment on how it impacted those that were involved. But this took what was usually a mere few minutes in a regular TV series and is often considered an afterthought, and it brought it to the forefront in providing an entire episode on it. So with that, I want to discuss the haunting reality of episode 4 of Adolescence and how its different approach made it stand out even more. Here is why Adolescence episode 4 is perfect. Just to let you know, this video will contain spoilers. The looking through the lens of it impacting everyday life. With this episode being entirely focused on Jamie's family and us seeing how 13 months later it was impacting their day-to-day life. This episode really shone a light on how even amongst the most unexpected of moments and most normal of days, small things could transport the family right back to when Jamie was first accused and when their lives changed forever. For example, it was a sunny day. It was Eddie's birthday. He'd just finished mowing the lawn and the day was starting out as one usually would. But all it took was for a birthday card from Jamie to arrive for Eddie's entire mood and persona to change, and for him to be reminded that his son wasn't there because he committed a horrific crime. Then, with his van branded with an insult which had no relevance to the case nor the type of person that Eddie was, the day then dropped to a level that we thought was the lowest, when in reality it was set to get far worse. What this entire opening section of the episode showed us was how by simply being related to Jamie and by being his parent, you were also seen as guilty in the court of public opinion, despite the fact that you may have had no influence on him in the slightest when it came to the crime. Plus, it also showed us that those thoughts within their mind and the reminder of what happened could hit you when you least expected it, and there was never going to be any escaping it. It was almost like a prison sentence itself, a prison that was inescapable because it was internal and only for you. This also occurred later on in the episode when the mood was lifted and the family tried to avoid all of the negativity that was being thrown their way. We saw them all go to the store to get some paint to cover the graffiti on the van, but whilst in there was a true crime enthusiast and conspiracy theorist that had no regard for Eddie and brought up the fact that he knew that Jamie was his son and he didn't believe that he did it. Showing again that even when out in public, it can find a way of coming to the forefront and dominating the conversation, when in actuality all Eddie wanted to do was escape it and live some kind of normal life whilst not being reminded or tormented whenever he left the house. Small moments such as him wanting to go back to the clerk in the store but stopping himself, but then also giving into his temper when he saw the vandalizers and letting his anger out on them. It highlighted how his emotions were going to be tested on days where he least expected it for the rest of his life. He didn't wake up in the morning and expect to have his van branded, to get into a fight and to also argue with store clerks. But that was now a part of his reality that he had to try and navigate through. We don't often see the immediate impact on the family of the murderers, but because this was the story of Jamie and not Katie, we got to see exactly that. So it was an unexpected feature, but one that was extremely powerful. Eddie was still protecting Jamie. A moment that I thought was extremely powerful in this episode was the journey back from the store where the family were in the van, following what was an explosive scene where Eddie had lost his temper in front of everybody in the car park. We were brought right back down to earth and into reality with Jamie phoning Eddie out of the blue. What was particularly interesting about this phone call was that Eddie didn't let on about any of the trouble that they were going through, how their lives were being impacted day to day, and the struggles that they were going through were all because of him. They just engaged in regular conversation, asked how each other had been, and Jamie wished his father a happy birthday. This showed the level of protection that Eddie was still giving to his son, even though he was the root cause of all of the problems that were now impacting their lives. With Jamie also mentioning that he was going to be changing his plea to guilty. It was a moment where Eddie was then rendered to the point of being speechless and him realizing that he was most likely never going to see his son outside again. Plus, it also showed that there was no more fight left to give and that the battle in court, which was probably all-consuming, wasn't going to be happening. Meaning that it was going to be over. It was a moment that felt very final, which we saw hit Eddie most during the ending scene. Jamie had denied committing the crime for the entirety of the 4 episodes right up until that point, but hearing those very words coming out of his son's mouth meant that his son was in fact a murderer, something that Eddie now had to come to terms with. When Eddie and Manda were in the bedroom, we saw Eddie specifically blaming himself for certain outbursts that he had when Jamie was younger, which he could have picked up on, and he also questioned if it was himself that led Jamie to be like that. He even questioned if the decision that he made to not be like his own father in hitting his son was the wrong decision to make, and that maybe he should have been more of a disciplinarian. The fact that he was taking on part of the blame showed that he wasn't willing to accept that the behaviour just stemmed from his son, and he was still looking to protect him in any way possible whilst taking on part of the blame himself because he didn't want to believe that his son could just be like that when their daughter was the opposite. The connection in the memories and stories. One element of this episode that I thought was constructed really well was the connection to the story that Jamie told in episode 3, which clearly left a mark on him. But as well as that, we also saw that it was the one that left a mark on Eddie too in episode 4. This was when Eddie took Jamie to play football, but because he was no good, the parents were laughing at him, the kids were laughing at him, and Eddie couldn't bring himself to look at his son. This not only connected to the story that was told in the psychologist character profile session in episode 3, but it also connected back to the response that Eddie had with his son in the very first episode when he saw the video of Jamie killing Katie. When Eddie first saw that video, his response was to look away from his son because he was ashamed of him, tying back to that natural response that Eddie had with Jamie when he was younger and when he was on the pitch. The importance of the connection of the stories is the fact that they both held the same story within them, and it impacted the both of them in different ways. At face value, it was a way that Eddie let his son down, and he didn't protect him in that moment, and they're both aware of that. That's not to say that because he did that, Jamie went on to be a killer, but it's there to show us that Eddie wasn't necessarily always forthcoming with how he felt about his son, and his son felt that. Plus, he also held on to it too, leading Eddie to have regrets. The ending scene. The ending scene for me was one of the most powerful moments in the entirety of the show. Earlier on in the episode, we heard Lisa say that she hadn't been able to bring herself to go into her brother's room since it all happened. And following Eddie hearing that his son had changed his plea to guilty and feeling as though he was the person that let him down, he went into Jamie's room, broke down in tears, tucked his teddy into bed and apologized to it and said that he wished that he did better, showing that he was taking on part of the responsibility for his son turning out that way and feeling as though he should have done more. These were all things that he wished that he could say to his son, but he couldn't because he was behind bars and it was too late. I did actually tear up when this moment happened because it showed that all of the emotions that had been building up throughout this episode finally rose to the surface, and they were now overflowing. The song Through the Eyes of a Child being played was something that also supported it so well and added to the emotions that the showrunners wanted us to feel. One thing that I thought was a nice touch in this ending scene was that the entire series concluded where the events all began, in Jamie's bedroom. What was once a room that housed the boy that Eddie loved became the room where a potential killer was detained, and it finished with it being a shrine of the boy that he felt that he let down. It also goes without question that the performance by Stephen Graham in this episode was simply one of the best that I've seen from him. The passion, emotion, and conflicted heartbreak that he had was something that you really did feel as it was being performed. And along with his This Is England performance and his performance in Help and Time, this is one that's right up there. Along with episode 3, I feel this episode, episode 4, was a piece of television that really left its mark on me, and for the reasons that I've just mentioned, it's why I feel it was perfect. So, there you have it, why Adolescence episode 4 is perfect. If you want to see more videos on Adolescence, such as a review of the series or why I think episode 3 is perfect too, then click on the card in the top corner, they'll be up there. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss future videos. What did you think of episode 4? Share your thoughts in the comments. As always, thanks for tuning into the video and I'll see you in the next one.